The meeting of the Rent Control Board is hereby called back to order. After this closed session, please join me in the salute to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'd like to have a report back on our closed session, please.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the one item on the closed session agenda, there were no public speakers and the board took no reportable action. That concludes my report.
Thank you. I'd like to entertain an approval of our minutes. Commissioner Foster.
I reviewed these yesterday and found no mistakes. Move to approve the minutes.
May I have a second?
Second.
We have a roll call vote, please.
Yes, Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska,
Abstained.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Now we have our special agenda item.
Thank you, Chair, and again, good evening to you, Vice Chair, Commissioners, Jonathan Holub, Executive Director. Yesterday marked a milestone in Santa Monica's history. On April 10th, 1979, a majority of the city's voters passed the Rent Control Charter Amendment on that day. So a very happy birthday to rent control in Santa Monica. Timed perfectly with Rent Control's birthday was the distribution of our spring newsletter, which most tenants and landlords should have received or will be receiving shortly. Versions in Spanish, Farsi, and Amharic are available on the Rent Control website. The newsletter covers a number of important topics, including information about implementation of AB 1620, the revision to decrease amounts in the regulations, and the City Council's strengthening of tenant protections earlier this year. The newsletter also provides information on several upcoming seminars. On Wednesday, April 24th, from 2:30 to 5 p.m., there will be a Fair Housing Symposium hosted by the City Attorney's Office. Speakers will include Shyla Myers, Senior Attorney in the Unhoused Persons Justice Project at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, attorneys from the Consumer Protection Unit of the Santa Monica City Attorney's Office, and other special guests. Topics will include the barriers unhoused persons face in obtaining permanent housing, the impact of fair housing laws on tenant screening policies, including sources of income and housing status discrimination, and a basic overview of fair housing laws. On Wednesday, May 1st, from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., the agency will be presenting Rent Control 101, which is a seminar for tenants on an overview of the services available through the Rent Control Office, how rent and amenities are defined, eviction protections, remedies available for excess rent, lack of maintenance, and loss of amenities. And on Thursday, May 2nd, from 10:30 to 12:30 p.m., the agency will be presenting a seminar designed for owners and managers that will explain the rights and responsibilities under the rent control law, how to use the Civics portal for online filing, and information on paying the annual registration fee online. All of these events will be held at the main library at 601 Main Street. To register, use the QR code in the newsletter or call our office at 310-458-8751 for assistance. This evening, I'd like to welcome our legislative lobbyist, Brian Augusta, who will be presenting a legislative update later this evening. Later, I'll be presenting the mid-year budget report, and I'd like to thank our office coordinator, Lima Noseworthy, for all her work on that, and she's here to help out tonight with any questions. You'll also be receiving a presentation on the annual report. I'd like to extend a very big thank you to Dan Costello and his public information team for preparing another thorough and very interesting report. It's a team effort and everyone there contributed, but I would like to especially thank Karen Evans for her work on Ellis Act Impact, and particularly Micah Michalski for taking the lead on the statistical elements of the report. You'll be hearing from Micah later, but I wanted to give him a shout out for all of his hard work on this year's report. So thank you for that. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
This is a time for public comment. Is there anyone? Okay, seeing there is none, we move on to item 10A. Can I please have a staff report?
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. This is an owner occupancy exemption application for 2516 California Avenue. Jacqueline Mosk and her late husband, Tom Mosk, had bought this property back in 1988, and the board had granted them an owner occupancy exemption application. However, Ms. Moss failed to return the annual certifications that we send, and she did not dispute the final determination that the exemption had lapsed, and so the exemption was lapsed in our record. She, however, has reapplied for the exemption, and the facts show that this property is a two-unit property, and that she continues to have the minimum ownership percentage requirements that are necessary. So the question before you is whether the record shows that she's supplied sufficient documentation that she's lived in the unit for at least 120 days before the filing of this application. And the record does show that. She doesn't own any other property in Los Angeles County. She submitted utility, financial, and government records to show that she continues to occupy the property. And the hearing investigator was sent out to the property because there are no rented units, and her report is also consistent with the claimed occupancy. For those reasons, staff recommends that the board grant this exemption application.
Thank you. Commissioner Foster.
I move that we support the findings of fact and conclusions of law and grant the exemption.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Ivanov.
Yes.
Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. Oh, shoot. Give me a second. Okay. It's doing something weird. Can I get a little help? Thank you. Now we're moving on to 10B. Can I have a staff report, please?
Yes, Commissioners, this is an appeal for the property at 2408 Ocean Park Boulevard, Unit 6. The tenants, Lita Salinas and Giovanna Diestra, filed a rent decrease petition alleging various maintenance conditions and reductions of housing services. The hearing officer granted them decreases totaling $335. The tenants have appealed the decision for conditions for which they were denied a rent decrease, as well as the amount of two of the items for which they were granted a rent decrease. The board reviews this matter as an appellate body, and therefore it should affirm the hearing officer's findings if they're supported by substantial evidence. As detailed in the staff report, except for roach infestation, substantial evidence supports the hearing officer's denial of rent decreases for the conditions raised in the tenant's appeal. And substantial evidence also supports the amount of the decreases for deteriorated walkways and laundry services. The hearing officer's denial of a rent decrease for roach infestation, however, is not supported by substantial evidence. The hearing officer found that the record showed that there was a serious roach infestation, but that the tenants were not entitled to a decrease because they had refused the services of the exterminator. But the evidence shows that when the exterminator showed up, there were existing plumbing issues that precluded the tenants from doing the prep work that the exterminator had asked them to do before they could proceed. And although by the second hearing of this case, the evidence showed that the plumber had come out and resolved the plumbing issues, there was no evidence that the exterminator had then been sent out to do the job. And therefore, the evidence, it shows that the problem with the roach infestation continued to be there by the close of record, and substantial evidence doesn't support the denial that was given by the hearing officer for this condition for those reasons. Staff therefore recommends that the board grant a $100 decrease for the roach infestation consistent with the range that's in the regulation, taking into consideration the tenant's MAR and the fact that this is an issue that affects the unit's interior. Therefore, staff's recommendation is that the board affirm the hearing officer's decision except to grant the additional $100 decrease and to affirm the findings of facts and conclusions of the law except for the modifications that are set forth in the staff report.
Thank you. Commissioner Ivanov.
Can we just get a little more clarity on how we arrived at the $100 figure? I understand that it's within the 15 to 175 range promulgated by the regulation, but how did we get to 100 instead of, let's say 120 or 130 or whatever?
So this was, if you look at the decision itself, there was infestation, a decrease given for exterior infestation was about $35, if I recall correctly. And looking at the other decreases that were given for other conditions, this seemed to be consistent with those decreases, and certainly should be higher because it's something that affects the interior of the unit, and it's in the range, and also taking a look at the MAR that was in this case.
Thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
It's very straightforward and clear, and I agree with the revision recommended for the infestation, and I move that we affirm in part and reverse in part the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law, and grant an additional decrease of $100 for the infestation and modify findings as noted in the staff report for 27, 29, 30, 31, and 157.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ghanska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now we move on to 10B2. Can we please have a staff report? Okay.
This is an appeal for 1138 Princeton Street, Unit D. Commissioners, tenant Deborah Gavlak of Unit D filed a rent decrease petition, and the hearing officer granted $430 in total decreases. The owner has appealed the decision. The owner argues that the hearing officer should not have granted decreases for window and carpeting because the tenant didn't allow for entry for repair subsequent to the close of record. The owner also argues that the carpeting only needed to be cleaned instead of replaced as required by the hearing officer's decision in its compliance section. And the owner also argues that no period of past reductions should have been granted by the hearing officer because the tenant had refused entry to perform repairs. Again, this is a situation where the board is reviewing this matter as an appellate body, and you should affirm the hearing officer's findings. They're supported by substantial evidence. As explained in the staff report, the alleged repairs or failures to allow entry after the close of record are not part of the record that's before you on appeal and can be addressed through the compliance process, and the landlord has actually undertaken has submitted a compliance request that is is being processed. An addendum compliance was actually already issued for the things that had been submitted in that compliance request. And as detailed in both the staff report and the supplemental staff report, substantial evidence also support the hearing officer's finding that the carpet is stained and deteriorated, consistent with many years of normal use, and is a reduction of the carpet amenity for which the tenant is entitled to a decrease, and that as a condition of compliance, the carpet needs to be replaced. Substantial evidence also supports the awarding of past reductions by the hearing officer in accordance with Board Regulation 4203. The record doesn't support the landlord's claim that the tenant did not grant entry to perform repairs. In fact, the landlord's witness confirmed that the messages that had been sent to the tenant to schedule repairs through the tenant portal were never delivered to the tenant because the tenant didn't have an account on that portal. And managed staff had not checked that those messages were undelivered. In addition, the record showed that the landlord had not served the tenant with the 24 hours written notice for entry to perform repairs, which is required under state law. Staff therefore recommends the board affirm the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Thank you. Commissioner Ivanov.
With respect to the compliance process that you mentioned, I noticed in the appellant's brief, there's a reference here to it taking over 6 months to adjudicate the compliance request. Is that accurate, or?
That's not accurate. The decision was just recently issued, and so while they submitted a compliance request before the decision had been issued, obviously you can't determine compliance with a decision before there is a decision. Now that the decision has been issued, the compliance process has been undertaken.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Foster.
Commissioner Ivanov, I had the same question that was answered satisfactorily for me, but I would point out that this also goes way back to the purpose of this regulation and process in the first place is oftentimes people won't fix things until they're motivated to do so. And then all of a sudden, some of them, oh, fine, we'll fix it now. But after a tenant named Daniel Westcott and some others brought it to our attention a number of years ago, we altered the process to have a look-back period because it wasn't fair that we were only awarding a decrease at the conclusion of the event, knowing that it had been a basket of goods that was not full that entire preceding time. So we actually fixed that in this process to have a look-back period. And so once in a while, you will see an attempt to kind of manipulate the timeline to suddenly come into a compliance a day before the hearing decision is given or a hearing is held, as just an attempt to not see that tenant awarded a decrease of any kind or for any reason. So this is something and not necessarily that that's what this is, but it's not the first time we've seen similar claims or kind of a, manipulation of the timeline. I'd be inclined to move on this item. Do you guys want me to move them all tonight? All right. I move that we affirm the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law in case P20230539.
Second.
May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ivanov.
Yes.
Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Now we're moving on to our administrative items. 12A, annual report.
I just lost it. Okay. All right. Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for having me tonight. It is my pleasure to present the 2023 annual report, and I'm happy to take questions at any time during the presentation. Don't hesitate to ask if anything comes up. So the new developments, all board-driven, the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act amendment to accommodate disabled tenants. Since its passage by the California legislature in 1995, there have been very few amendments to the law that allows owners the right to set new base rents for most new tenancies. Passage of AB 1620 in 2023 marked one of those rare occasions. The amendment now allows a qualifying tenant on a property of 5 or more units to move to a comparable or smaller unit on an accessible floor of the property without having to pay a new market rate rent. This accommodation is only available to tenants with a permanent mobility-related physical disability, and tenants must make the accommodation request prior to an accessible unit becoming available. Due to the strict requirements for taking advantage of this new law, it may have limited applicability, but for those who otherwise would not be able to afford a market rate rent of a different unit, it could be life-changing. Civics has been enhanced with new features, or Civics Portal. The user base for Civics, the agency's public-facing portal for filing registration forms, fee waivers, exemption applications online, that grew by approximately 500 new users, ending the year with approximately 1,350 accounts. And because this is primarily property managers, a lot of them have multiple properties in Santa Monica. We're estimating that more than half of controlled properties are now using the Civic system for filing forms. Users submitted, usage has been very high. Users submitted 2,738 tenancy registration forms through Civics during the year. Most of those were for tenancies that began in 2023. Also in 2023, about 900 tenancy registration forms were still submitted on paper. This resulted in a ratio of online filings to paper of about 3 to 1. And as the number of users and their familiarity with the system grows, it's expected that the share of online filings will continue to increase. Staff has made several efforts during the year to improve the features of the system, including how forms display on the user's dashboard, as well as the ability to retrieve comprehensive information about their properties as reflected in the records. Now each site master record provides a link to a property summary report, which includes the entire MAR history for every unit on the property, and that can be generated with a single click. There are new procedures for filing excess rent complaints. Those have been revised. Now tenants must first present their claim directly to landlords. This opens up the possibility of a quick resolution without the need to go through a formal process. If a landlord returns the excess rent collected, then the tenant may not file the petition. If there's no resolution after 30 days, they may file. This notice requirement is also consistent with the decrease petition process, where a notice to the landlord is also required before filing a decrease petition. This streamlined process appears to be delivering faster resolution of these claims, but more data collection and analysis is going to be required to really know the impact of that over time. And then we've been analyzing tenant contacts, and that's been leading to new insights regarding our diversity and equity and inclusion effectiveness. We're trying to analyze how effectively we were reaching all the communities in Santa Monica. Staff began collecting data regarding the people who contact us for information or pursued administrative remedies available to them through the agency. We started that in September 2022 with the property addresses actually being recorded as well when possible. So last year we had a very small sample because we only did the last quarter of the year. But we were able to map and identify which areas were more or less likely to contact us or file petitions. Staff also noted whether tenants requested to have services in Spanish and if services were actually delivered in Spanish. And we'll see a map on that in a little bit. In addition to the property addresses, we also started recording unit IDs when we were able to. And then that information was used to help us analyze the length of the tenancy and the rent levels of the tenants that are contacting us. When we removed all of the duplicates and the properties that were not subject to rent control where the addresses were in there, we ended up with a sample of 695 unique unit addresses being recorded in 2023. Of those contacts, 255 were identified as tenants that moved in before vacancy decontrol, with the remaining 441 having a tenancy date that was on or after January 1st of 1999, and we'll continue with that shortly. Sorry, there's a lot of numbers in here, so I apologize for reading directly off the slide a little bit too much, but you know, if any questions do come up or anything, please let me know. So here we have a breakdown of units subject to rent control by type. Annual changes to the number of rent-controlled units vary little from year to year and are mostly due to changes in exemption status of properties and Ellis activity. During the 24 years of vacancy decontrol, slightly more than have been.
Utilization
Yeah,
of,
we haven't
of vouchers.
received that data directly from the housing department. Some of that some of that would just be related to a lapse of, you know, tenants have gone off of Section 8 or have moved away. Because this is a voucher program, as you know, it's they have to be using that voucher to qualify for the program. And then once we find out that a new tenant has moved in, or we've been notified that the tenant is no longer receiving that voucher, we do lapse that exemption, and it shows up as a.
It just seems like a high number. How does that compare to years past? Or trends of the past? And if you don't know right away.
I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that it was a big jump, and it was something that stood out to me as well. But
Yeah.
We weren't really able to dig in with housing.
That's concerning.
as to-
I mean, I know the city has taken measures through fair housing to make sure that landlords are educated about taking vouchers and are prohibited from discriminating for source of income from from our city, from our state law. At some point, either in the meeting or offline later, I'd be curious to see more data about what caused that drop.
I've also noticed anecdotally that not all landlords know that they can apply for a Section 8 voucher when they're accepting a Section 8 tenant. So they do know that they need to accept that as a form of payment, but they're not necessarily aware, especially newer landlords, are not necessarily aware that we offer a fee waiver for that. And that may be a piece of that puzzle as well, but I'd only be speculating as to how much. The other number that stood out to me is in 2023, there were 194 formerly long-term units that were either rented at a market rate for the first time or withdrawn from the market under the Ellis Act or otherwise became exempt. That number is pretty consistent, but it is, it's almost 10% of the long-term tenants that we have now at this point. So it's starting to feel like a lot. So here's our map of who called us when we were able to record an address. This is not necessarily who gave us their full address with their unit number, where we were able to dig a little bit deeper. But you can see on this map in blue. Sorry, I keep hitting that move forward. In that blue, those were the service was delivered in English, and learning to recognize and respond to microaggressions. We also began a process of reflecting on how effectively we are serving the community to ensure services were leveraged to translate important information into Spanish, Farsi, and Amharic. This includes the summer mailing, the fall newsletter, the rent control information sheet, outlining basic rights, and the community resource directory.
So I have a quick question, and usually I don't interrupt, so please forgive me. So you mentioned Farsi and Amharic, and when you have tenant contacts, why isn't that not reflected on this chart?
We did not directly deliver service to any tenants and record an address in those languages. We did have a few times where we've had to, I've had to ask Haka to help me in Farsi, and we've had conversations with tenants that way, but we're not capturing that data. That was actually a landlord, I believe, the most recent one that we did that. But as of right now, the way that we're capturing that data is when we actually are delivering that service in that language. And we have only been delivering that service in these two languages to tenants and recording it, capturing it. I can also speak to the fact that there have been, we had a staff member that spoke Korean, and there were some service delivered in Korean, and that was not captured in this either. And that's an area where I certainly would like us to expand and make sure that when we do deliver service in those other languages, that we do make a note of it, just so that we can have data on it. Because without that data, we can't really know what we're doing.
So,
I agree that we should capture all data.
is what you're saying tenant contacts are being made in other languages, just not in significant enough numbers to kind of show up in a report like this?
Correct, yeah. And we're limited on, what languages our staff members can speak at the time that somebody's reaching out. So sometimes somebody will initially call and ask for service in a certain language, but they're able to either have an interpreter on their end or an interpreter on our end, and we carry on the service in English. It would be great. I would love to speak more languages than just English, but I'm not there. So, I think we're making an effort to try to be available and accommodating to people who call that search for service in other languages, but our most effective delivery of services has been in English.
Right.
What's that? The skaters.
Outside for foreign languages.
Yeah. They're on board. They're definitely on board with it. So as you can see, there was a widespread distribution of contacts from all parts of Santa Monica. And when we compare the percentages of contacts by city area to the percentage of units in each is D and F. Let's see. We also began reviewing the number of tenants who used an administrative remedy, such as a decreased petition or an excess rent complaint, and map that relative to the city area. So as you can see from the pie chart, tenants in cities areas F and G were far more likely to use administrative remedies, representing over 50% of petitions filed, while representing 38% of rent-controlled units. Tenants in area B were slightly less likely to contact us and the least likely to seek an administrative remedy. This is slightly different from last year, so it would be interesting to see as we collect this data for more years how this averages out. But it's a little bit too early to really identify a specific trend by neighborhood, I think. But we're getting there. So we'll continue to gather and analyze this data. We've been doing that so far in 2024. And staff is going to continue to look critically at what we can do to identify and reduce barriers that may prevent some community members from using our administrative remedies, such as the language translation services. I think that's going to be big going forward. So a question came up from this data is who is more likely to contact us? In 2023, there were 695 unique tenant contacts where staff were able to record the full address. This sample allowed us to analyze the tenancy dates and the MARs of the tenants who reached out to the agency. Figure 3, and I'm using the figure numbers that are in the annual report, indicates the distribution of the MARs for all of these 695 units. So you can see it's kind of a widespread, and the MAR for these units, the average mean of these units, it's $2,027, which is relatively close considering the sample size of the median MAR for all controlled units, but that's slightly higher. It's 2313. The volume of the calls shown under the curve line and the shape of the curve shows how this is distributed relative to the average. So, for example, there are very few callers from units with MARs above $4,400. It really starts to flatten out there. Figure 4, we split the data by tenancy date between long-term tenants and market rate tenants. So The average MAR for the 255 long-term tenant who contacted us was also close. But it was slightly higher than the median MAR of all long-term tenants. So our sample was 1,179, but the median MAR of all long-term tenants is $1,091. And then when looking at the MAR of those 440 market rate tenants, we see an average MAR of 2522. And when we compare that to the median MAR of all market rate tenants of 2592, that's very close as well. So I think we can say that this is a pretty good representation of of everybody in the city, because we're getting a pretty good distribution. Obviously, the standard deviation for long-term tenants is going to be much tighter. That's why it's a much higher peak, because those rents are all concentrated in that lower end because of when they were established. Versus the market rate tenants, it's a much longer period. So you see that wider distribution. And then I think what was interesting, one thing that was really interesting that came from the data, and you can see it in Figure 5, we really started to see that after about 10 years of occupancy, that's when tenants become more likely to contact us. That's kind of when that flip occurs of when, the tenant's being there versus when they're reaching out. The longer a tenant's been there, the more likely they are to reach out, which makes sense. And it's about 10 years, which is where we start to see, maybe that's when they're starting to, deal with a little bit more deferred maintenance or some other issues that they need. They might need a little assistance or a little guidance on how to approach that with their landlord. So to better understand the rental housing market in Santa Monica, we categorize the units by size. So either 0 bedroom, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 or more bedrooms. As Figure 2 shows, almost half of all controlled units, and there's 27,603 total controlled units. Almost half of all of them are 1 bedroom. And then the next largest segment, which is more than 1/3, is those 2 bedroom units. And then studios and 3 or more bedroom units make up a very small combined percentage. And then we also, so 82% of the units that are controlled, they are those 1 and 2 bedroom units. So I think that's going to be an important figure to keep in mind when we look at some of the other data down the road here. I can go on for like 5 hours if you all will let me. No, I'm kidding. So we've tracked this also by city area to get an idea of the breakdown of where he has almost 22% and has more than twice as many units as Area D, which is 10%. And then Area C, which is more like the downtown, is actually less than 4% of all of our controlled units. So we'll look at the median rents by unit size. And in 2023, there were 2,355 new tenancies registered. We still may get some late registrations in 2023, registration for 2023, but compared to last year, the number's about 10% higher. And as you can see, from the chart, we did get a little uptick. We had a downturn of registered units, and now we're starting to trend back up. Median initial rental rates for units of all sizes have risen annually, with the exception of temporary downturns during the recession. So we saw a bit of a downturn in response to that in 2009, 2010. And then the pandemic, we saw a downturn in median rents in 2020 and 2021. There appeared to be a bit of a correction in 2022, and then less of an increase over 2022 for 2023, because that big correction had happened in 2022. While the number of units registered remains lower than pre-pandemic levels, the initial median rent across unit sizes met or exceeded the highest recorded levels since tenancy registration began. So for those 0-bedroom units, which again, there's not a ton of those, they had the same, there was a 0% increase. They were about the same. The 1-bedrooms, we saw a 2.8% increase over last year, but the year before that, it was much bigger. It was 9.8%. 2-bedrooms, we only saw a 1.4% increase, but we had that big jump of 14%. And then 3-bedrooms, which kind of tends to be the most volatile group in terms of median initial monthly rents, the 3-bedroom plus, we saw increases of 10% and 8.1%. All right, so we're talking about affordability. In Figure 19, we compare the current median MARs for all the controlled market rate units with rents of long-term units, and it shows the it shows the difference. The difference between market rate and long-term rents is roughly 150% higher for one-bedroom units and larger. Figure 24 shows that income needed today to afford units in Santa Monica. Prior to vacancy decontrol, about 84% of units were considered affordable to low-income households. Today, that number is less than 4%. Most of these roughly 1,000 units remain affordable only because they are on properties that are required by agreements with governmental agencies to provide low-income housing. In contrast, the rents for only about 16% of units in 1998 required household incomes at 110% of the area median income or higher, whereas today that number is above 95%. If we took two individuals living together that each made a full-time salary based on Santa Monica's living wage ordinance, which is $19.73 an hour, if they worked full-time, that would just over the 30% recommended by HUD. They'd be paying 30.63% of their gross income to rent a 0-bedroom unit, to rent a studio. So they, even two people in a studio at that living wage would not be considered affordable. The California Department of Housing and Community Development reports the area median income for a 4-person household in the greater Los Angeles area did increase from $91,000 in 2022 to $98,200 in 2023. By HUD affordability standards, a family of 4 would need an income of at least an additional $41,800 to be able to afford a 2-bedroom unit here in Santa Monica at the median price. And then to afford the median price of a 3-bedroom or larger size unit, the median, the household would need more than double of the area median income. They'd need an additional $91,800. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the Ellis Act. It's a state law that gives owners in rent-controlled jurisdictions the right to exit the rental housing market. As the trend line shows, there have been relatively few withdrawals in recent years. With eviction moratoria that had been in place limiting withdrawals during the pandemic, it was reasonable to expect an uptick once those moratoria ended, but we did not see a return to 90 or so units being withdrawn annually like there were before the pandemic. Figure 27 shows a net result of Ellis activity since the law's enactment in 1986. Although 691 properties were previously withdrawn, about 30% have returned to the market under rent control, and an additional 15 properties were redeveloped and with units re-rented within 5 years of withdrawal and thus reverted to rent control. Overall, since 1986, there has been a net loss before redevelopment of 2,324 units on 504 properties. But when we account for redeveloped properties, the net loss due to Ellis activity was 2,066 units on 489 properties. So figure 33 shows a percentage of withdrawn units by city area. Overall, withdrawal activity in Area E is the highest. After accounting for units returned, comparing to the number of units by city area, we can notice that the greatest percentage of controlled units have been withdrawn are in areas C and E. Many of these units withdrawn in area C consisted primarily of SROs withdrawn in the earliest years of Ellis activities. Over one-third of the units in Area C, over one-third of units in Area C have been withdrawn. The lowest percentage of units withdrawn has been in Area B and D with 4.6 and 4.1% respectively. Post-Ellis use by type, we can see that slightly more than 50% of post-Ellis use remains for housing purposes: apartment, mixed-use apartments, condos, condo mixed-use, and single-family dwellings. A little information on the Public Information Department. The Public Information Department is often the face of the agency. In 2023, Public Info staff engaged in nearly 9,200 telephone contacts. This was actually a decrease of 13% from the prior year. An initial response to 1,843 emails were also recorded, which represented a 40% decrease from what was recorded in 2022. Demand for in-person service has remained low since the pandemic, and accounted for approximately one in-person visit for every 10 phone calls recorded. Total web page views decreased in 2023 by approximately 33% from the prior year, with over 101,000 hits registered, not including the civics page. And that's a big part of, we think a big part of why there was that decrease there is because we weren't able to report on how many page hits the civics portal received. Because of the way that Google Analytics has changed over the last year, we weren't able to capture that data. We speculate that other reasons for the decrease, it may include that people are just going directly to the civics portal. It may include that they just need less information from the website than because of, like 2022, they really needed a lot of information from Measure RC, and that we didn't really have anything big like that this year. And then I also like to think that the website is laid out a little bit more logically for some people, and that might be a reason that they're a little bit more direct to where they need to go, but I don't have any data to back that up. So just wishful thinking on my part.
Is that also our theory for why we have some of the drop-off with the telephone and email contacts, just that there was no major agenda item like RC?
That's what we're speculating. We don't really know, but that seems to kind of fit. We saw a really huge uptick because of Measure RC, and even pre-Measure RC, when everybody thought they were getting a 6% increase for the full year. That drove a lot of phone traffic and email traffic, and then once that settled and we got people educated on it and they started to understand, we did see a reduction in that. So. A little quick overview of the hearings department. For the hearings department adjudicates administrative proceedings brought under the Rent Control Charter Amendment and accompanying regulations. Petitions and complaints may be filed by tenants or landlords, and the agency itself may refer certain matters for hearing. New decrease petitions filed increased from 78 to 87 in 2023. 66% of these petitions were filed by market rate tenants, which represents about the same percentage of market rate tenants overall, 75.8% of petitions versus 75.3% of total units. During 2023, 35 hearing officer decisions were issued, 23 appeals were filed, 19 of which were heard by the board. 100% of those appeals heard by the board were upheld, did uphold the hearing officer's decision. Mediation has still proven to be very successful. 33% of decreased petitions were fully or partially resolved in mediation, 40% of construction decreases, and 77% of excess rent complaints.
Mike, I just want to stop you for one
Yeah.
moment and just draw the public's attention to that and my colleagues. We, for the low price of $9.50 a month, we deliver legal services that are, I think, unsurpassed in any rent-controlled jurisdiction anywhere. Sorry for all the past cities where all of you have worked and stuff. But for this many petitions to be resolved before they had to come to the full hearings process or go to court, That is a city delivering services, and I hope that tenants and landlords alike are appreciative of that process and that this agency does it so well. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that note, I'll wrap up the report here. The annual report also includes a summary of the legal department's litigation activities and statistics on a variety of staff reports the department prepared for the board. The report is posted on the website under the reports section. You can read or download the report from our website, which is santamonica.gov/rent control. And as always, if there are any questions, please give us a call. You can contact an information coordinator, information analyst. Our number is 310-458-8751, and we're available by email, rentcontrol@santamonica.gov. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Foster.
Yeah, Micah, don't go anywhere.
Okay.
Now the discussion happens. So a couple of things of note to me that you didn't necessarily highlight in your report, which is fine. On page 14, the owner-occupied 2 or 3 unit properties, it's been in very recent years that we implemented that process to re-verify annually whether somebody still lives there or not. And lo and behold, when we started checking, it turned out tons and tons and tons of them no longer lived there, but whose properties were still exempt from rent control. No more, for several years now. That has been remedied to great effect. And I just want to point out that in 2023, 37 properties, 83 units no longer qualified for this exemption. Some owners notify us when they move off or sell, and some don't, and we find out through our processes. And I just think that's huge. When you see further down in the next paragraph that at year end, 451 2 or 3 unit properties, 1,094 units are exempt based on owner occupancy. It's just so important that we continue to monitor that closely and recognize, the staff for following up and making sure that those tenants are taken care of. That, and I think there was only one other thing you didn't cover. What did I have down here? Nah, that's all for now. Does anybody else have any comments? This is the biggest must-read report of the year. This is the hot, hot, hot ticket. This is the publication to read. And you did an awesome job presenting it to us, all the highlight reels. It disgusts me how high our market rate rents are. And I just want to say to anyone listening that if we, for all the things we do to build deed-restricted affordable units, to enforce acceptance and fair treatment of fair housing laws and acceptance of Section 8 vouchers, until we control at some common sense rate the acceleration of market rate rents, this will never be an affordable community to anyone who isn't already here. If you don't already own, if you don't already rent, every day that goes by, these rents are jumping again and again and again. So it's incumbent upon us to protect the tenants who are in place, whether they've been there 35 years or 8. It doesn't matter. Or 2 or 15. It doesn't matter. Every bit of affordability we can preserve while still delivering a fair return. It's just incumbent upon us to stay strong, maintain the strength of this agency, and the will of the people of this city. So thank you for your report.
Thank you, Commissioner Foster. Vice Chair Gonska, you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you. I would just echo those comments, especially about the unaffordability of market rate rents today, and not just now, but for a number of years, to a point where even with rent control, after a tenant moves in at market rate, even with the small increases that, when we put a cap on the increase in MARS, even with those small increases, often people living in their units for 5+ years are still essentially at market rate or above market rate because of those increases, because their base coming in at market rate is so high. So it's definitely an issue.
Commissioner Ivanov? No? Okay. Any other comments? Thank you.
Chair, we just need a consensus from the commission, from the board to send this report to the city council per the charter.
Okay.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ghanska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Moving on to item 12B, Brian Augusta, our legislative advocate.
Chair, just before Brian gets started, I just wanted to alert the board to a minor correction in the report. A typo was corrected and revised copies were made available to the board and the public this evening. Thank you.
Hello there.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members. Excuse me, Commissioners. Brian Augusta, your
Would you
legislative...
like some water?
No, I have some, and I even took a sip before I came up here to avoid that, but here we are. Good evening. I'm as mentioned, your legislative advocate in Sacramento, and I'm here today to provide my at least twice yearly report to you all, to update you on what's happening in Sacramento. As you know, I frequently come in the spring, such as tonight, to give you an overview of what's coming, and then I usually come sometime in the fall and recount for you everything that has or hasn't happened. So, you know, tonight is sort of like, if you follow baseball, we're very early in the baseball season. There's 162 games. The same is true of the legislature. There's a lot of great ideas out there. Everyone thinks they're going to make it to the World Series of legislation, but only 2 teams can make it that far now. So many of the bills I'm going to talk about tonight, you know, it's a long season. There's a lot of runway between here and the finish line, so much of this will change. But it does illustrate, what I'm going to talk about tonight illustrates sort of what some of the common themes are in the legislature on housing and tenants' rights. And so I'm going to try to touch on some of those themes very generally, and then of course, as we always do, if there are questions, I'm happy to take those at the end or as we go. So, you know, one theme this year, of course, in stark contrast to prior years that I've come and presented to you all, we have gone from a record budget surplus to a growing and significant deficit, which I'm talking now, of course, about the state budget, which we expect, or they expect, that deficit to continue over multiple years. Right now, the estimates range as big as $73 billion deficit. So these are big gaps in our funding in California. As I said, much in contrast to recent years when we've had surpluses that have allowed us to pour money into programs like some of our key affordable housing programs and create new initiatives. Now, with the deficit, much of the conversation in the budget process is about staving off cuts, maybe relooking at programs that were created over the last few years with money from these surpluses. So far, as I noted in our written report, the conversation is at a stalemate about potential cuts to housing programs, but undoubtedly cuts are coming elsewhere. So it would not be surprised if that continues to be part of the conversation, despite the importance and primacy of the affordable housing discussion at the state level. But also wrapped up in that is that even though we have a deficit in, you know, the state general fund, one option available is to go to the voters and ask to essentially borrow from future funds by issuing bonds. And in California, we have done that, you know, a number of times to bring in additional revenue that then fills some of our key affordable housing programs. There is a conversation this year to do that for both for housing, but also for schools and also for climate-related investments. And so part of the conversation is how big could, together, all three of those bonds be? And in light of our bonding capacity and the budget deficit. And so that number seems to be hovering around 15 billion, which will be sort of divvied up between those three big pots in some conversation that happens among leadership in the governor's office and other stakeholders. So those of us who are sort of keeping an eye on that are watching how that conversation is shaping up. But if housing got a third of it and 5 billion, that would be less than what has been proposed so far by the Assembly. And Assemblymember Wicks, who is leading on that with her $10 billion bond proposal. So we'll see how that conversation shapes up in terms of supplying new revenue to expand affordable housing. But for the most part, as I say, this year, not a big conversation, right, around new spending. If anything, it's staving off cuts to housing programs and other investments that support housing affordability. So really a lot of the conversation is, as you would expect, around policy choices that don't cost the state money. So I want to touch on three themes there. One theme that's not in these remarks is rent stabilization. That we, in past years, we have seen bills on, of course, on Costa-Hawkins reform, Ellis reform. This year, there are no significant bills touching on rent stabilization, but there are a few bills that I want to touch on that sort of are of critical importance to renter stability. And then to the larger sort of questions around housing affordability and housing and the housing market and stability of renters in that housing market. So sort of the first big theme I just want to point out is that I never know exactly how ideas seem to catch on, but a number of legislators this year have put in bills in the sort of broad category of tenant screening and application fees and security deposits and sort of that front end requirements for renters to rent new housing, which some of those things like screening fees and screening policies and security deposits can be a barrier for tenants to get new housing. So there are at least 5 bills that kind of touch on those in that area. One is Assemblymember Lee has a bill, AB 2304, to further protect tenants who might find themselves in eviction action, but then eventually win that eviction action. And state law currently provides some protections to ensure that that eviction action doesn't show up on the tenant's credit report or rental history, which can be a negative mark for 7 years. Right now, most cases are masked if the tenant, unless the landlord wins within a certain time period. But there are exceptions. Mobile home tenancies are not covered. And cases that are filed as unlimited civil cases, which means that the amount in the complaint is above a certain limit, those for some reason are excluded. So 2304 would close those loopholes and protect all tenants equally. And that's an area where the legislature has done a lot over the years to sort of close those loopholes. So in some ways, not breaking a lot of new ground, but closing an important gap in that. AB 2493 by Pellerin, again, continuing on that theme, tenants can be charged application fees sometimes when there's not actually a unit available or where there's no realistic possibility that they're going to be the tenant selected. So this bill puts some limits on that by saying that if no unit is available, you can't charge the fee. The law currently allows for a waiver of that by the tenant, so that would eliminate that. And then if a landlord owns multiple units or multiple buildings, they can only charge one fee to that tenant for screening for all of their units. 2785 by Wilson goes a little bit further and says, if they're not selected, you have to return the fee within 21 days. Which is an interesting twist on that conversation. And if the fee exceeds a limit in the law that says it can't be more than your actual cost, that you have to return the fee. Then Assemblymember Friedman has AB 2801 dealing with some recurring themes around security deposit return at the end of the tenancy, which is I'm sure we hear a lot of these questions, as we just heard in that report of what people call about. There's a lot of abuse in that area, and some believe that landlords sort of assume they're going to get most of the security deposit back. They're going to retain most of the security deposit at the end of the tenancy. So Assemblymember Friedman is trying to erect some limits in that regard. For example, prohibiting charging the security deposit for sort of routine cleaning or carpet cleaning, which is a thing we see almost every time. Like, this is just a normal cost. The law also has an option for a post-return walkthrough at the end of the tenancy. And this bill seeks to sort of tighten that up by saying, if you didn't identify something in that walkthrough that needed to be fixed, you can't later charge for it, which is sort of the spirit of that provision anyway. And then right now, if a tenant tries to get their security deposit back, there are damages, but only if they can demonstrate bad faith. This would change it to sort of flip that on its head and make a strict compliance. Any violation is a violation that entitles the tenant to damages, including up to 3 times their actual damages. And then finally on this theme, Assemblymember Haney has a bill dealing with pets. And many landlords will have a blanket policy excluding pets or certain categories of pets. This would sort of require landlords to allow pets in almost every instance, and tries to deal with an inherent problem, which is to say that the tenant must be approved must be approved without consideration of whether or not they're going to bring in a pet, and then have the conversation about the pet. And then bans pet rent, so you can't charge additional rent for having a pet. So that bill moved out of its first committee on earlier this week, despite opposition from landlord groups. So interesting to see how that conversation continues. Second theme I want to note, information sharing. Despite what we heard as numbers decreasing in certain calls here to the rent board, there's growing, the body of law is growing, right? We've enacted, say that, for example, the Tenant Protection Act, a number of other changes to the law, and increasingly, and perhaps this is why we're seeing decreases elsewhere, but there's a lot more information out there now, where people are trying to fill those gaps in tenants and renters' understanding of what the law is and what their rights are. There's a bill, AB 21, read my own notes, 37, which by Assemblymember Bryan, 87, which would establish an Office of Tenant Rights, which really is just going to be information posting of the most important tenant protection sort of summary in an understandable format. Not clear the future of that bill, but that would put it at the Civil Rights Department so that there would be this sort of information available statewide. Kind of a narrow bill, but increasingly important. When we passed the Tenant Protection Act in 2019, as you know, it establishes a rent cap of 5% plus CPI, or a maximum of 10%, and that is regional. CPI is regional. So it changes each year and it changes by region. So this bill, AB 2278, would require that, originally it was the State Department of Housing, now it's the Attorney General, post what that rent is, so everyone has the same information and can rely on that. And then a final theme, sort of a broader theme, is corporate ownership of housing. There are two sort of far-reaching proposals on this, one of which is SB 1212, which would ban real estate investment trusts from owning housing in California. AB 2584 by Assemblymember Lee would prohibit business entities, including LLCs, REITs, and corporations from owning more than 1,000 single-family units. So sort of targeting the increasing sort of Wall Street corporate ownership of single-family homes that are rented out. We hear a lot from renters in those units that corporations, not surprisingly, don't make the best landlords and are also very aggressive about raising rents. So that is sort of part of that conversation. But then the final piece in that is SB 1201 by Senator DeRosa, which is a bill that she has done now a couple of years, which would do a seemingly simple policy change in this realm, which would be to require that LLCs and corporations, when they register their entity name with the Secretary of State, must disclose who are the beneficial owners, who are the actual owners of the LLC, for example, which will be an important, if that were to pass, an important advancement in sort of understanding the nature of ownership. If we're thinking through the lens of housing, it could be as simple as understanding, having a better picture. If you wanted to create some distinction between large landlords and small landlords, that's impossible if you can't tell how many different LLCs Bob Smith owns. But if we can get to that information, then we can start to make those distinctions. And much like the other two bills I mentioned, you also get a better picture of just the extent of ownership by these entities. So all those bills are still very early in the process, not clear what the future of those will be. But those are some of the big sort of, I think, themes that we're seeing this year that impact renters and housing affordability. So I'll pause there and see if there are questions or comments on anything I've touched on so far.
First one, recognize Commissioner Foster.
Thank you, Chair. Brian, thank you. Mr. Augusta, thank you for your report. It's always interesting, and it feels like you're here a lot, and it's because time is flying.
Yeah. Well, I did come an extra time last year, so that might be why.
There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. So 1201 DeRosa, corporate transparency. I mean, that's something we even run into here with multifamily apartment buildings. Sometimes it's hard for tenants to identify who their landlord is. We've seen bills like this before. They haven't made it. Do you see any different trajectory for this one? Anything different about this one, or any better chances this one has?
I mean, great question. I think a few things are changing. Can't say for sure that this year will be different. But one is that in addition to federal law, which at least requires this reporting and make it available to law enforcement, the state of New York enacted a law similar to what's proposed here. In the final changes requested by the governor, they too made it limited to law enforcement, so it's not in a publicly available database. But that, I think, is changing the conversation. I think there's growing recognition that the anonymity of LLCs is a hiding place for nothing that's very useful to the public good. Notwithstanding that there's still, the distinction of their legal liability, but in terms of hiding sort of who owns what. The other hurdle that that bill ran into last year was the cost for the Secretary of State to collect and report this information. So I think on that bill this year, that's going to be another important part of that conversation is, can they reduce the cost? Can they overcome some of those practical limitations that the Secretary of State would face in trying to implement it? But that, I think, the bill made it through two policy committees sort of unscathed last year, so we'll see.
I mean, couldn't they entertain the notion of allowing cities to take this on one by one rather than using the budget excuse once again not to do it?
That's an interesting thought, yeah.
Just don't stand in our way. Let us do it. The only other thing I had was the Attorney General publishing the allowable rent increases under the Tenant Protection Act. That just seems like tremendous common sense at a very low cost. There aren't that. So do you know how many different regional CPIs there are?
I don't off the top of my head.
I mean, just even a ballpark? Are we talking 8 or 12? Are we talking 20 or 30? It's really only, very low numbers. Because we even have units, here that fall under that category and all around the region. And that's a huge problem because it's self-enforcing, right? The tenant has to know about it in order to protest the raise in their rent that exceeds it. So without it being a rent-controlled unit, the rest of these tenants are being left out in the cold.
Well, and I think that will become increasingly important, Commissioner, with the changes that 567 implemented last year, which actually put a little more teeth in those limits and give tenants more remedies when the landlord
Right.
violates it. So,
But they
yeah.
still need to know what their allowable rate is. We send a newsletter publishing exactly that. We put it in local newspapers and everything else, what those rates are. But these tenants don't have the benefit of that. So I'm glad to see that moving through. Thank you.
Commissioner Ivanov.
For AB 846, the Bonta bill.
Yeah.
Do you see any chance or likelihood of it getting amended or any discussion of that going on?
Well, so there's a few different things happening in that space. So AB 846 takes the basic concept of the Tenant Protection Act and applies it to units a certain category of units that were excluded from the Tenant Protection Act, i.e. Low-income housing tax credit units. And in the simplest form, like in hindsight, that exclusion probably should have never been included, and if it weren't there, we would have that protection now. Now there's a bill to try to close that gap. The Tax Credit Allocation Committee, the state agency that allocates tax credits and regulates those units, has just adopted a regulation that does much of what, not everything, but much of what 846 would do. The one limitation is it's only sort of prospective, and there's a twist that would make it applicable to existing units if they look to convert, but, those are it's going to be fewer. So there's still an unmet need there, but all of that shows that there's sort of like that's becoming the easy floor for this policy. And then, as you may know, the Biden administration recently also imposed a cap that's similar to this of 10% on those units. So then I think it sort of changes the question around, what should be the floor here. Some of the conversation has been that these units should be, there are some structural problems in the low-income housing tax credit program, right, that allow rents to increase pretty rapidly. But I think people are looking at it from the perspective of the state being sort of I don't know if you should describe it as floor, ceiling, I don't know. But we have this, which is an anti-gouging provision. We want to maintain the ability of local governments to enact stricter controls, which it does. And should tax credit units be at a different level than market rate units, or should we have a uniform policy? That's kind of the conversation. We won't know until later in the year when that bill moves. It's now in the Senate, but they won't start really looking at those bills until June. So a little bit up in the air.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. So my question is this. Also on AB 2187, the Office of Tenants' Rights,
Yes.
do you propose that might go over will, or will there be anybody there to advocate for it?
I think one of the questions around that bill is whether it's duplicating anything that may exist. The Department of Consumer Affairs had previously published a tenant guide. There are other guides available, published by public and private entities. So I think that's part of the conversation, but it's a little bit early in that process. I think our report said that it was going to get a hearing next week, but that's been pushed off. So that may be an indication there's more conversation going on around that bill. I can, through your staff, report back what I hear when we get back to Sacramento about, has it been said and where's it going?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your report.
Yeah,
I always
thank you.
appreciate you coming down and taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Okay, now we're moving on to our mid-year budget report.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of the mid-year budget report is to update the board on the agency's budgetary experience as of the midpoint of the fiscal year and to make projections for fiscal year-end revenue and expenditures. The report is informational only and requires no board action. In June of 2023, the board adopted an operating expense budget of $6,138,053, along with a non-operating expense of $52,932 to cover the 7th of 10 annual PERS loan payments. The original revenue projection for the fiscal year, which is primarily obtained through registration fees, was $6,129,732. Actual registration fee revenue as of the first half of the fiscal year was $5,991,832, which is $86,528 less than the total projected for the fiscal year. But with aggressive collection efforts, staff anticipates an additional $60,508 will be collected by fiscal year end. The total registration fee revenue projection for the fiscal year is $6,052,340, which is $26,020 less than projected. It is anticipated that the projected revenue shortfall will be offset by savings in other areas. Overall, total projected revenue is $6,104,913. The budget revenue amount was, the budget revenue that was projected originally was $6,129,732, which results in a projected revenue of $24,819 less than the anticipated amount that was in the adopted budget. The projected revenue shortfall, however, is offset by likely expenditure savings. Operating expenses for the first half of the fiscal year totaled $2,860,990. A combination of retirements, an unanticipated resignation, and continuing vacancies indicated salary savings of $110,651, which are not surprisingly offset by projected higher expenditures and as-needed and temporary employee costs, in addition to higher overtime allocations. Supplies and expenses are currently projected to be $21,819 less than budgeted, and as the report indicates, certain capital outlay savings could be realized. So in sum, the adopted operating expense budget projected a small deficit of $8,321 at year end. Current projections, however, indicate modest net revenue of $5,486 by year end. To the extent there is net revenue at that time, those funds will be added to the board's reserve. So we are looking to come out a little bit ahead than what we projected. That's basically the summary of it all. And I'm available for any questions, and Lyman knows Worthy's here as well if I can't answer it, which is wholly possible.
Do any questions? Vice Chair Gronska.
So when the budget was proposed last year, there was a very small budget deficit projected, and the board asked for it to come back to us with some adjustments so that we could narrow that gap, which the staff did, and we were very thankful for. Can you speak to how that has netted out so far in this fiscal year? Those adjustments that were made to, I think it was around some of the procedures with petitions that came in.
Right, there were, that was the activity related to staff having to figure out the excess rents. Is that where the savings came in? Can I get reminded by staff who was there? Or am I misquoting that?
Yeah, and Lima can speak more to the numbers, but it was a proposal to reduce our mediations by directing some cases straight to hearing. I can report that we have been largely unsuccessful doing that because there's been a lot of ADU construction resulting in a lot of construction cases, more than we've usually seen. Those are fairly complicated in terms of the evidence presented in them. So our mediator really strives to get those resolved at that stage because there's a lot of work that goes into a final decision on those. And in most cases, it's successful. In some, it has not been. So there have been a lot of decreased cases and construction decreased cases related to like permanent amenity reductions due to this construction. Typically, it's better if we can all talk about it in a mediation and get that resolved. So there's been a lot of, a lot of mediations in that respect. But we also have seen a lot of parties just declining mediation, and so naturally it would just go to hearing anyway. And in addition to those reasons, we have seen a lot of petitions come through, and the dockets for our hearing officers are quite full. And so in the interest of getting those decisions issued, hearings heard, thought it best to funnel things to mediation first if it could get resolved. So the plan, as we thought it might work out, didn't work out that way. But I think there's been some savings in other aspects of the budget. But the other folks can speak more to all of that. But that's what happened on my end of things.
Interesting. So where did the savings occur?
So I think a good portion of the savings occurred in salaries unrelated to the mediator, who it sounds like we used more mediator time than was expected because of, as I mentioned, earlier retirements than expected, a resignation that wasn't expected, and not filling positions yet. But those, of course, were offset in other areas. But there's just been some savings in other areas that are mentioned in the report that were unexpected. So it wasn't where we anticipated the savings, but there was savings anyway. So it balanced out in the end.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Lima. Thank you, staff.
Thank you, staff. Appreciate it. Okay, our next order of business is adjournment. So do I have a motion to adjourn?
Chair, I'd like to adjourn in recognition of the third graders of SMMUSD schools who for the past 2 months have been learning about how city government works. They have written tickets on each other, which proved to be their favorite part of the process. They elected mayors and vice mayors and police chiefs, and the most popular job turned out to be the trash collector, because they got to write tickets. If your pencil was in the wrong spot on your desk, they took great joy in that. But it culminated with either members of our city staff and our elected officials either traveling to the schools or the kids coming here. And so my son's class 2 days ago was sitting out in this audience, and they got to come up and play with our microphones. And so I just want to adjourn in honor of the third graders of Santa Monica and Malibu.
Okay, and who would like to second our adjournment?
I'll second.
Thank you. Hereby I call this meeting adjourned. Have a good night. Thank you.